from now, perhaps.
Okay, I'll just put the link in the chat for the YouTube thing.
I think people are still coming in pretty quickly.
So those of you who have Facebook accounts or Twitter accounts, here is the link in the chat. You might want to disseminate it widely while we are still waiting to let people know that we are online. Well, I think with your permission that we should perhaps begin so that we don't run out of time, since we have a lot to do tonight. And let me welcome everyone to this, I checked, 42 seminar, 42 edition of the seminar, Princeton-Bucharest Seminar in Early Modern Philosophy, at least according to our website. And tonight we have a truly planetary meeting. If you look at the affiliations of the 4 speakers, covering 3 continents, and a lot of meridians and a lot of hours. So good morning and good evening, because we are having we are on all sorts of time tables right now. The meeting tonight is on Hume, Skepticism and the Passions. We will have 4 papers. We will go one after the other and we'll have discussions at the end. Our first speaker tonight is Margaret Watkins with a paper on spirits and skepticism in Hume's treatments of the passions. Margaret, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. And I want to thank Manuel for suggesting this panel and the organizers for allowing us to be here. It's the start of my day here on the West Coast, so but I'm nocturnal, so I do have some slides to share. These are really just quotations, so you can follow along as you like. And for the sake of time, which I do want to be cognizant of, I'm going to not read all of the quotations that are present here. I just want you to have them available if you can. And I'd like to say that as a word of introduction, what is at stake here in what I'm trying to do today is thinking about what kind of skeptic we understand Hume to be, particularly with respect to what he would have called natural philosophy. Is he a skeptic in the Lucretian vein? Some commentators have argued that he, particularly Stephen Buckle in a very helpful article on Hume and the Passions, that he's implicitly materialistic. Or is he more skeptical about natural philosophy, particularly as applied to human nature more generally? I think actually he becomes more consistently skeptical on this point after the publication of the treatise. And so that's what I'm going to be trying to argue today. So many of you may know that Hume famously compares the work of the Treatise of Human Nature, his earliest published work, to anatomy. But his dissections are of perceptions and experiences, not bodies or brains themselves. He's explained in the introduction to the treatise that natural philosophy is in fact dependent on what he calls the science of man, and that's the science on which he is about to embark. And so he's going to eschew appeal to deliverances of anatomy in his discussions of the more foundational science. And so you have the first quotation here, where he says that his intention was never to penetrate into the nature of bodies or explain the secret causes of their operations. And at the end of this quote, he says that he expresses what I think is maybe suspicion about the efforts of that anatomy. As to those who attempt anything farther, I cannot approve their ambition till I see in some one instance at least that they have met with success. So I've highlighted that last sentence because I think it suggests Hume's reluctance to enter into questions of natural philosophy stemming from a kind of skepticism about its validity. And that seems consistent with his statement in Of the Rise and Progress of the Arts and Sciences, an essay published in 1742, where he says that religion, politics, metaphysics, and morals form the most considerable branches of science, and the mathematics and natural philosophy, the only two that remain, are not half so valuable. Attempting to penetrate nature's secrets, Hume seems to think, is a risky business, not likely to lead to reliable results or do much good if it does. And yet, throughout the treatise, we do find a few forays into explicit physiology and a great deal of language that seems dependent on anatomical theories that would have been popular at the time. And if you're interested in reading about the humors in this respect, Chuck actually has a wonderful paper on this, which perhaps we can link to later online. So my hypothesis is that at least sometimes in the treatise, Hume uses that kind of language, that physiological language, literally, and attending to that can help us understand aspects of his theory of the passions. I have in mind particularly his references to animal spirits, or sometimes just spirits, those refined liquids thought to play a role in voluntary motion, sensation, and passions. I think we tend to read past them or just to assume that they're metaphorical, standing in for phenomenological concepts that might easily be described in other ways or in a more contemporary idiom. But sometimes that redescription is not easy at all, which I think suggests that Hume is using current theories of anatomy as plausible explanations. So I'm going to look at the second book of the treatise's references to animal spirits, or spirits in the relevant sense, where it seems that that might be shorthand for animal spirits, in comparison to his treatment in the Dissertation of the Passions, first published in 1757. And I think this survey shows us that taking seriously the possibility that Hume has a physiological theory in the background illuminates some confusing aspects of his treatment of the passions. Moreover, there is one section in the treatise that proves particularly difficult to interpret as anything but a reference to literal physiology in the discussion of the effect of custom on the passions. He removes that section in the dissertation, I think, suggesting that he becomes increasingly unwilling to presume the physiology over time. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because it's not sort of essential to that argument about the change between the two texts. This final quote on this slide is from the very first paragraph of the second book, so the introduction to his treatment of the passions. And it seems to me actually a fairly straightforward reference to a physiological understanding of animal spirits in a list of things that might give rise to original sensations that then the passions are reflecting on, and therefore are secondary sensations. In this first passage on the second slide here, Hume is explaining our tendency to love our relations and acquaintances. He says that we seek diversions with which we endeavor to forget ourselves and excite our spirits from the languid state in which they fall when not sustained by some brisk and lively emotion. Now, I think it's easy to read this first reference to emotion in the contemporary sense as a particular feeling or affection. But in the concluding sentence of this this long passage, which is actually the second quotation on the slide, he refers to giving emotion to the spirits, which I think suggests emotion as motion, which is an older sense of the term whereby it is more synonymous with agitation. The physiology of the day would have considered spirits to be kinds of liquids. We could then read the claim that the spirits fall into a languid state when not sustained by emotion, as akin to saying that water becomes calm when not sustained by a rolling boil. That reading is consistent with the next spirits passage, which comes in Hume's discussion of the influence of comparison in the section on malice and envy, which also uses emotion and movement as apparently synonymous, and that's the last passage on this slide. Now you'll see here in that passage a strange reference to being insensible of a sensation, and it's not really clear what that would mean. We might think that what Hume has in mind there is simply something like attention. So you might have chill bumps on your arm, you might not be aware of that sensation, but when somebody points it out to you, then you you know that you were feeling something. So perhaps it's right to say that you have a sensation because the conscious mind recognizes the feeling, even though you're not attending to it at present. In that case, the movement of spirits here could be interpreted metaphorically, I think, as describing a background experience of which we are unaware. On the other hand, Hume might just be using sensation a little loosely here, and he might mean that we really don't feel the motion of the spirits at all. And then I think it's more difficult to read this as a phenomenological reference to spirits. The movement of the spirits is not something that we find by introspection. It's an event that we infer to explain certain results. And the result is an affection that we ultimately feel as connected with, for example, vast expanses or large numbers. Now, none of these references to the spirits survive in the dissertation. The majority of the remaining references to the spirits in the second book of the treatise, however, appear almost unchanged. They come from section 2.3, 4 and 5 of the causes of the violent passions and of the effects of custom. And condensed version of these sections make up the sixth and final section of the dissertation. In each text, the preceding section address questions of motivation, introducing the point that we believe reason alone can motivate because we mistake calm passions for reason. These preceding sections also note that the violence or felt emotion of a passion is not equivalent to its strength or capacity for motivating action. In both texts, the ensuing discussion introduces what is sometimes called Hume's conversion principle, which is that any emotion which attends a passion is easily converted into it, though in their natures they be originally different from and even contrary to each other. And as you can see here, the language from the dissertation really mirrors the treatise, and both abound in these references to spirits. So I want to focus on the part of the treatment where I think we do see substantial change between the earlier and the later texts. In the treatise, Hume breaks and adds a new section called Of Custom. The section opens with the claim that nothing has a greater effect both to increase and diminish our passion, to convert pleasure into pain and pain into pleasure, than custom and repetition. Custom has two original effects upon the mind in bestowing, he says, a facility in the performance of any action or the conception of any object, and afterwards a tendency or inclination towards it, and from these we may account for all its other effects, however extraordinary. Although some of the material from this section survives in the dissertation, it doesn't do so under the heading of the significance of custom. Both sections continue to refer to the spirits, but the treatise adds a further discussion of the effect of custom and repetition on the spirits. Noting that repetition itself produces pleasure, Hume adds that the pleasure of facility does not so much consist in any ferment of the spirits as in their orderly motion, which will sometimes be so powerful as even to convert pain into pleasure and give us a relish in time for it, what at first was most harsh and disagreeable. Right, so these are the sections that mirror one another, and this is the section that's added in the treatise. It's rather long. Now, in the final paragraph here, Hume returns to give an oblique explanation for how custom can render a calm passion stronger than a violent one. Custom gives an inclination and tendency towards an action where it is not entirely disagreeable and can never be the object of inclination. And he's appealing here to a distinction from Joseph Butler, that's the late eminent philosopher. And Hume claims that this effect obtains for active but not passive habits. The facility takes off from the force of the passive habits by rendering the motion of the spirits faint and languid. But as in the active, the spirits are sufficiently supported of themselves, the tendency of the mind gives them new force and bends them more strongly to the action. Now, that paragraph by itself, I think, makes very little sense to the contemporary reader. Mainly because we don't know what passive and active habits are just from this one paragraph. Butler's distinction serves a moral point. So what he's saying is that going over the theory of virtue in your thoughts, talking well, drawing fine pictures, he says, is so far from necessarily or certainly conducing to form a habit of it in him who thus employs himself, that it may harden the mind in a contrary course and render it gradually more insensible. But if we put the principles into action, then curiously, the habit of action becomes stronger, while the impressions that may have initially motivated those actions weaken. So the passive habits are just thinking about virtue, the active habits are actually acting virtuously. So Butler is describing how our behavior can resemble what Hume describes as action from calm passions. But what Hume goes on to do, and Butler does not, is explain this effect in terms of spirit physiology. The motion of the spirits becoming faint and languid diminishes the force of the passive habits or the impressions, while in active habits, the spirits are sufficiently supported of themselves, and the tendency of the mind adds to their force and bends them more strongly to the action. So unlike the section 4 discussion, this discussion, precisely the part that Hume removes in the dissertation, I think makes a lot more sense if we refer to spirit, or we interpret this references to spirits physiologically. So the section 4 references to spirits, they all suggest something that I think can be understood to refer to as sensible mental state, something like vitality or perturbation, what we might call arousal. So those are these references. But it's really not clear what kind of phenomenological experience corresponds to the orderly motion of the spirits that we see referred to here. Now, it might be something like a flow experience, which contemporary psychologists talk about, but that's not obviously motion. It looks more like concentration. On the other hand, the metaphor of flow certainly does suggest a certain kind of motion. But in the next paragraph, I think things get really wacky, where Hume says that the facility takes off from the force of the passive habits by rendering the motion of the spirits faint and languid, etc. Here, I think the spirits are really offered, they seem to be offered as a mechanism explaining the effects of decreased sensation with increased ability to act. They are that by which the tendency to feel perturbation decreases, while the tendency to carry through action increases. So drawing on some work that Marina Frasca-Spada has done, talking about the discussion of the Malebranchian influence on Hume's theory of belief, I think we can add something to what the text gives us. In brief, very brief, if we understand Hume as obliquely referring to that Malebranchian physiology, the explanation that he gives here is more complete, although we wouldn't accept it. Without the reference, it constitutes little explanation at all. So Frasca-Spada uses Malebranche to help interpret two different ways that Hume talks about the phenomenology of belief. We conceive of the objects of belief with special vivacity as individual perceptions. But that special feeling has two aspects, she says. One described in terms of steadiness, solidity, and firmness, and another as that vivacity. Now, the distinction between those two aspects is not highlighted by Hume, but it fits nicely into a Malebranchian understanding of how the spirits behave. Sometimes the spirits themselves move energetically, presumably causing feelings of perturbation and enabling action, but sometimes they move more freely because they run through particularly deep and large traces in the brain opened up by frequent use. Now, the free movement of the spirits in that second sense comes from precisely what Hume identifies as the source of the power of strong but calm passions, that is, custom, which increases the facility of actions. Since any voluntary action already requires the participation of the spirits, they are sufficiently supported of themselves to get going. The tendency of the mind, its bent or groove, if you will, that makes the action easier to perform. Now, I don't think Hume needs that physiological explanation. He could have simply observed the correlation and emphasized the experiential evidence of acting from habit, making actions easier. But I think he wants to give as much of a causal explanation of human motivation as he can. And that causal explanation is ready to be had for the violent passions, but not the calm passions. We feel the violent passions, and we think we feel them preceding a voluntary action. But when he talks about the calm passions, he comes really close to saying we don't feel them at all, although I don't think that ultimately we want to say that. So it's striking then, in a discussion that survives largely intact in this dissertation, it's those last references that Hume chooses to remove. And my suspicion is that he saw that he was relying heavily on the physiology in that discussion and wished to remove the appeal to the increasingly controversial hypothesis within physical anatomy. And that leaves him without much of an explanation, as many commentators have noted, for how calm passions can motivate or how the habit of strength of mind might develop. But that doesn't in itself vitiate the claim with which he ends the dissertation. He says that in the production and conduct of the passions, there is a certain regular mechanism which is susceptible of as accurate a disquisition as the laws of motion, optics, hydrostatics, or any part of natural philosophy. We can observe a correlation between repeated action and the ease with which that action is performed in the future and infer a causal relation from that observation. He has independent reasons for the claim that reason alone does not motivate. He can then infer that if we find ourselves motivated without noticing a passion in the background, there must still be one there. Now, does any of this suggest that in the treatise, Hume's account of the passions is implicitly materialistic, as Buckle suggests? I don't think so. Like Spinoza's account of the passions, Hume's deterministic analysis of the passions has a moral point, though a very different one. I propose that we take him at his word in his discussion of liberty and necessity when he says that the lack of necessity in human actions would constitute an absolute subversion, as he says in the Treatise of Morality. If we can make moral judgments and provide moral reinforcement through discipline only if we, and positive reinforcement only if we see actions as reflective of motives, the cause of which we find in a person's character. This means that it's a bit misleading to ascribe, as Buckle does, to Hume, along with Hobbes, a view of the passions that means that human beings are not the originators of their actions because those actions are themselves caused and caused by motions which are passive because they are themselves caused. That goes through on a certain interpretation of originators, but there's another very important sense in which we must be, for Hume, the originators of our actions. The actions signal the self that is behind them, and is that self and its qualities that is the subject of moral judgment. Even if I am so deterministically caused by the history of the universe that I could not possibly be any different than I am, my actions will still be my actions insofar as they proceed from this organism and not some other one. This is true even if many of the internal springs of my actions result from the influence of others, as they must be according to Hume. It therefore matters that there be a deterministic story to tell about the passions, one that is regular and susceptible to an accurate disquisition, even if that disquisition never gets us to the underlying physiology. Now, Hume might believe that there's some physical mechanism in the background, and I think he floats the hypothesis and appeals to it at certain places in the treatise, but he doesn't need it to get the moral value from this kind of determinism about action. So finally, he does make this really tiny change to the dissertation that I think suggests to me that he might want to shore up the power of inferences based only on correlations, even in the absence of references to an underlying mechanism. At Treatise 2.3.3.10, after explaining that strength of mind implies the prevalence of the calm passions above the violent, he writes that no one has this virtue sufficiently as never on any occasion to yield to the solicitations of passion and desire. From these variations of temper proceeds the great difficulty of deciding concerning the actions and resolutions of men, where there is any contrariety of motives and passions. In the dissertation, this becomes, as never on any occasion, to yield to the solicitation of violent affection and desire. From these variations of temper proceeds the great difficulty of deciding concerning the future actions and resolutions of men. I think this change corrects the misleading impression that solicitations of passion and desire might have given that strength of mind, might have given that strength of mind allowed action without any passion or desire whatsoever. But the reference to future actions also makes it clear that Hume is not referring to a general problem of determining what motivates people to act or judging that there is some causal story to tell at all about their motivations. He's instead saying that given the multiple and varied ways in which passions motivate, human behavior is extremely difficult to predict. Whether this is what he actually meant in the treatise is a question I can't answer, but it seems that in the dissertation, he's taking an extra step to avoid any implication that human behavior is ultimately inexplicable in retrospect. We find Hume across his work, I think, in an odd position vis-a-vis natural philosophy. He's utterly convinced of the superiority of much of modern philosophy, but he retreats from reliance on the natural anatomical theories that were current during his time. And to some extent, I think that's exactly what we should expect from a mitigated skeptic. Unlike Descartes, he thought these explanations were uncertain, and he was not going to plant his flag beside them. His other remarks, however, such as those of the rise and progress of the arts and sciences, suggested despair of anatomy ever achieving its stated aims, and one wonders if Hume shared Cavendish-like suspicions of microscopes. We cannot, however, understand his skepticism to imply a denial of the importance of moral judgment. His reliance on spirit physiology seems to decrease over time, but his insistence on the importance of our ability to judge moral distinctions remains constant. It is false philosophy, he tells us, in Of the Original Contract, that refines away virtue or moral duty by sifting and scrutinizing it in every light or position in which it may be placed, not the true philosophy of the mitigated skeptic.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret, for, among other things, a very good timing. So let's thank Margaret. And we have to move straight forward to the next paper. Please do ask questions or signal fingers or whatever in the chat while we are going along. So at the end, I can see who wants to ask what, and then we can in this way save time. Right. So our next paper tonight is Hume's skeptical methodology and the moderation of the passions. Manuel Vázquez Villavicencio. Manuel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Claudia, Jana. Thank you very much to everyone for being here. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present my work and share the work of others here. So thank you. And I will read my piece, so I will read it now. In the introduction to the Treatise of Human Nature, Hume presents an unflattering diagnosis of the philosophy of his day. The reason for such an unfavorable situation is the prevalent ignorance in the philosophical milieu of what seemed obvious to him. He claims, I quote, "It is evident that all the sciences have a relation greater or less to human nature, and that however wide any of them may seem to run from it, they still return back by one passage or another." End of quote. Even the disciplines, the less related to human affairs, such as mathematics, natural philosophy, and natural religion, are for Hume irreparably subject to the grip of human nature. That is so because there is no knowledge that is not mediated by our mental capacities and which is not to a greater or lesser extent about us. As Hume himself puts it, even in the case of natural religion, I quote him again, we ourselves are not only the beings that reason, but also one of the objects concerning which we reason. End of quote. Because of this, Hume proposes the study of human nature as the starting point of philosophy and the sciences, and experience and observation at its only solid foundation. The importance of the experimental method for the study of human nature that Hume presents in the treatise has not gone unnoticed. We can think about interpretations like John Laird's, Norman K. Smith, Graciela Di Pieris, Jacqueline Taylor, and many others. Hume scholars have also noted that he did not limit himself to a simple adoption of this method, but that he produced a version of his own, that is, for example, the position of John Knoxon. However, the role played by his conception of human nature in his approach to the experimental method has been less remarked. For Hume, nature has deeply interwoven intellectual, emotional, and social aspects. The studies concerning the methodological role of his theory of induction and the studies emphasizing the relevance of history in his conception of experience have shown the importance of the intellectual and social aspects of human nature in Hume's methodological approach. By contrast, the importance of the emotional dimension of human nature is still largely ignored. However, I contend that the role of emotions in Hume's philosophical method becomes patent when one takes the correct measure of the references to epistemic emotions that he makes in the introduction to the treatise, when presenting the methodological basis of his project. I understand by epistemic emotions the emotional states which manifest themselves as part of a methodologically guided process of belief acquisition. In the text of the introduction to the treatise, these references revolve around the motivational role of curiosity, the first source of all our inquiries according to Hume, and the passions influencing the manifestation of curiosity. I argue that a reconstruction of the methodological principles that Hume advances in the introduction to the treatise allows us to identify four main prescriptions. The text in question is Treatise Intro 810. It's very long. I will only present my interpretation of it. So the first prescription I identify in this text is that The objects of research peculiar to the science of human nature are our cognitive capacities, our mental contents, and our mental processes to the extent that we can form any notion of them on the basis of the experience. That is in Treatise Intro 8. The second prescription says, or it makes sense, that the explanations peculiar to the science of human nature must reach the highest level of generality without going beyond the realm of experience in the pursuit of explanatory principles concerning our cognitive capacities, our mental contents, and our mental processes. That is also in Intro 8. The third prescription says that one who applies himself to the science of human nature should moderate her curiosity in cases where this passion will lead her to ignore the other prescriptions to obtain increased satisfaction by going beyond the realm of experience in her research. That is in Intro 9. And fourth and last, the experiences which serve as the basis for the philosophical reflection proper to the science of human nature must be gathered by the careful observation of the behavior of human beings in the various circumstances in which they find themselves without resorting to control experiments. That is in Treatise Introduction 10. Prescriptions 1, 2, and 4 are relatively uncontroversial. They reflect Hume's skeptical and empirical engagement. Prescriptions 1 and 2 result from questioning the certainty of the fundamental notions and explanatory schemes of the metaphysics of Hume's time. When Hume claims that the proper research object of his science of human nature is not the essence of the mind, but its powers and qualities, as he says himself, to the extent that we can form any notion of them, he is excluding the metaphysic of the substance from the picture on the basis of its inconceivability. By claiming that an explanatory ideal based on the pursuit of original and ultimate principles is improper for the science of human nature, Hume is questioning the applicability of analogical reasoning to establishing universally valid principles. Analogical reasoning becomes fallacious when used to go beyond the realm of experience. In that case, the supposition of resemblance between the explicans and the explicandum is no longer valid. Thus, by endorsing prescriptions 1 and 2, Hume introduces into his methodological approach a skepticism founded on the impossibility of going beyond the limits of experience. With the first prescription, Hume stresses the importance of the social dimension of human nature for his methodological approach. For him, control experiments, although relevant in natural philosophy, are not able to explain the phenomena at the heart of moral philosophy. In fact, instead of illuminating their causes, control experiments would contribute to conceal them further. The premeditation of control experiments disturbs the operations of the natural principles of the mind in such a way that it would be, and I quote Hume here, render it impossible to form any just conclusion from them. In the introduction to the treatise, Hume insists on the fact that to be able to arrive at the right conclusions, the philosopher who works under the principles of the science of human nature must take the experiences at the basis of her reflection from, I quote, men's behavior in company, in affairs, and in their pleasures. This move reflects the social dimension of his empiricism. The third prescription concerns the motivational dimension of research. In certain circumstances, philosophers may be led by the force of their passions, of their emotions, to pursue objects of research to which they cannot form, of which they cannot form the slightest notion of, or for which it is also impossible to arrive at an explanation correctly based on experience. To practice philosophy so earnestly, says Hume, shows a profound ignorance of the kind of satisfaction that philosophical inquiry can yield. According to Hume, a philosopher does not find satisfaction only in discovering the object of her investigation. When the philosopher is aware of having reached the limits of both human experience and her capacities, the acknowledgement and confession of her own ignorance can also be a source of satisfaction. She can receive content by avoiding the error of treating her hypotheses as they were the most certain principles Hume claimed. So the moderation of curiosity, the first source of all our inquiries, is the via regia for the philosopher to achieve this kind of satisfaction. This is so because Hume puts at the heart of his philosophical method an emotional mechanism of the human mind that makes our desires disappear in the face of the recognition of the impossibility of their satisfaction. He claims, I quote, "For nothing is more certain than that despair has almost the same effect upon us with enjoyment, and that we are no sooner acquainted with the impossibility of satisfying any desire than the desire itself vanishes." End of quote. That is Treatise Intro 9. This mechanism is based on how Hume considers we are affected by an outcome sure or established. When we desire something, we alternately consider obtaining it or losing it. This alternation makes us feel uncertain, as Hume claims in Treatise 2, 3, 4, 7. This uncertainty keeps our passions on the move. However, when a result is confirmed, either because we are sure we will get the object we desire, or because we are sure we will not get it, this security takes away the uncertainty and leaves the mind left to itself, says Hume. For Hume, when this happens, the mind loses its ardor and immediately languishes, as he claims in Treatise 2, 3, 4, 8. However, when it comes to curiosity, this mechanism is not as straightforward as it seems at first glance. Its effectiveness depends on the philosopher acknowledging her inability to satisfy her desire to know and contenting herself with the more delicate satisfaction provided by her admission of ignorance and her prudence in avoiding error. This is problematic in human terms, since the passions and principles of human nature which concur in the manifestation of curiosity can prevent the act of recognition necessary for the desire to know to disappear. In this case, I'm thinking particularly about principles of human nature, such as those which Hume exposes in his discussion of the analogies between philosophy, hunting, and gaming. Hume uses these analogies to illustrate how engagement in an investigation or an activity in general can intensify our interest to pursue an objective. On the virtue side, this mechanism helps us keep our attention fixed on the goal we want to achieve. However, it can have a less favorable effect. The intensification of our interest may prevent us from perceiving errors and false assumptions that should make us consider the relevance of our activity and the propriety of the emotions that motivated it. When applied to curiosity and philosophy, this mechanism can make us consider valid research objects or explanatory approaches contrary to the methodological principles of the science of human nature. When things turn that way, the philosopher's curiosity becomes unreasonable because it is founded on false judgment, as Hume explains in Treatise 2, 3, 3, 6. The philosopher believes herself capable of discovering objects of research of which she cannot form the slightest notion of, and consequently of which she is also incapable of establishing an appropriate explanation. This has important epistemic and emotional consequences. First, the philosopher is carried away by unreasonable curiosity. First, the philosopher who is carried away by unreasonable curiosity can only fall into error, at least regarding what she set out as the goal of her inquiry. To satisfy her passion, she has no other option than to have recourse to unintelligible entities and equally incomprehensible faculties to explain them, as Hume shows in his critique of ancient and modern philosophies in Treatise 1, 4, 3, and 4. Second, the philosopher who, motivated by such misplaced curiosity, persists in her research, may fall prey to negative emotional states such as those which Hume, referring to the medicine and the psychology of his time, calls melancholy and despair, and about which he speaks at length in the conclusion of Book 1 of the treatise. The mechanism is, in a sense, very simple. repeated frustration of a desire causes sadness and melancholy, and eventually despair, when the impossibility of satisfying the desire is present, but the emotional disposition at the bottom of the desire is unaltered. The third prescription aims, then, in my sense, to counter these epistemic and emotional unfavorable results through an emotional framing of the philosophical research. This framing consists in keeping the passions at the basis of philosophical research, in particular curiosity, free of excess and within the domain of reasonableness. Because as Hume himself says, I quote, "Nothing is more requisite for a true philosopher than to restrain the interpreted desire of searching into causes, and having established any doctrine upon a sufficient number of experiments, rest contented with that, when he sees a further examination would lead him into obscure and uncertain speculations. In that case, his inquiry would be much better employed in examining the effects and the causes of his principle." End of quote. That is in Treatise 1146. The third prescription constitutes, therefore, a principle of moderation of curiosity. This moderation of our desire to know is based on the alignment of our epistemic pretensions with our mental capacities as human beings. As the text just quoted shows, this is a necessary effort to keep the philosophical investigation into the right track, the path of what Hume calls true philosophy. That is, a skepticism empirically founded. In this sense, the third prescription is something the philosopher must constantly keep in mind. However, that does not mean giving up the exercise of her curiosity. The desire that she should not feel, or where appropriate, the one that she must suppress, is the one whose presuppositions are false. The philosopher can continue to pursue the satisfaction that a curiosity aligned with Hume's methodological principles provides her. For example, she can continue to question the nature of causality, but without postulating the existence of an active principle in objects that we cannot conceive of. She could be content, that Hume himself was, with psychological principles which she can conceive and whose effects she can trace through experience. This does not imply a total renunciation to the satisfaction she aimed at, because for Hume this approach was so satisfactory that he affirms in the abstract of the treatise that, I quote him, "If anything can entitle the author, that is himself, to so glorious a name as that of an inventor, 'tis the use he makes of the principle of association of ideas, which enters into most of his philosophy." End of quote. So, and this is the end, if this reading seems plausible to you, we can conclude that when discussing Hume's philosophical method, we not only need to consider its skeptical and empiricist streams, we also have to take account of the motivating role of curiosity and the importance Hume deemed to the moderation of this passion. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Manuel. Let's move on then to our next speaker tonight, who is Untitled, on a talk entitled "How Not to Be an Uncouth Monster, Human Buffer on Epistemic Role of the Sentiment of Humanity." Annick, you have the floor.
Okay. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay. Go straight in because I don't want to go over time. Yeah.
Press F5 so that we see it full screen, or yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. At the end of book 1 of A Treatise of Human Nature, Hume faces a crisis. Having pushed his skeptical reflections to the extreme, he finds himself socially isolated. No longer certain whether he can trust his own reason, he's in the grip of doubts that other people experience as a threat. In this situation, he calls himself an uncouth monster. So here's the first slide. I'm first frightened and confounded with that forlorn solitude in which I'm placed in my philosophy, and fancy myself some strange, uncouth monster, who, not being able to mingle in a united society, has been expelled all human commerce, and left utterly abandoned and disconsolate. Fain would I run into the crowd for shelter and warmth, but cannot prevail with myself to mix with such deformity. I call upon others to join me in order to make a company apart, but no one will hearken to me. Everyone keeps at a distance and dreads that storm which beats upon me from every side. Hume does not explicitly say that the reason for experiencing himself as a monster is that other people treat him this way. Yet their hostility is symptomatic of the situation and seems to increase his feelings of despair and that have been caused by his preceding skeptical reflections. Hume's narrative thus reveals a two-way relationality that ties the self's own inexperiential reality of being monstrous to how the self appears to others. He describes himself as being looked at, hated, and feared for his deformed opinions. When looking back at these others, Hume foresees on every side dispute, contradiction, anger, calumny, and detraction. In his own inner world, he finds nothing but doubt and ignorance. Emotional as this crisis is, at the heart of it lies a profound epistemological problem. Hume's reflections have demonstrated that, quote, memory, sense, and understanding, unquote, are all, quote, founded on the imagination and the liveliness of ideas, unquote. Taking this conclusion seriously means that Hume is faced with a dilemma. All he can do is choose betwixt a false reason and none at all. Reason is false when it follows the trivial suggestions of the imagination that confronts the minds with contradictions and manifest absurdities, and reason becomes non-existent when it acts alone by following the understanding and the more established properties of the imagination. Reason then extinguishes all belief in never-ending higher order reflections, quote, leaving not the lowest degree of evidence in any proposition, either in philosophy or common life, unquote. Many commentators have offered illuminating discussion of these difficult passages by reading them in the light of the arguments Hume presents in Book 1. In what follows, I will pursue a different route. Instead of looking back at the earlier parts of the treatise, I will focus on the textual resources available in Book 3. The aim of this is to shed light on an account of epistemic judgment Hume implicitly relied on and continued to operate with, even after the skeptical despair of Book 1. This account essentially revolves around the belief that we have to acknowledge the other as a cognitive equal if we want to use reason in the establishment of an epistemic relationship with the world. In forming this relationship, the sentiment of humanity performs the crucial role of aligning the principle of judgment underlying the self's own beliefs with those of others, thus bringing into play a form of reason that prevents the monstrous experience of Book 1, during which, quote, all opinions loosen and fall off themselves when unsupported by the approbation of others, unquote. In order to reveal these aspects of Hume's account of judgment, I will compare him with Claude Bouffier, whose works were widely discussed and available during Hume's time at La Flèche. So I will go into some detail now in the analysis of what Bouffier says, and then turn to Hume and use part of the concepts that are central to Bouffier's account to unpack Hume's account of epistemic judgment in relation to his uncouth monster passage. In the Éléments de métaphysique, which most likely was available to Hume at La Flèche, Bouffier lays down the fundamental principles of knowledge, thus returning to a theme he has already dealt with in his influential Traité de première vérité. In both works, Bouffier rather traditionally conceives of humans as special because they have reason, and yet he argues that it is due to a sentiment shared by all that reason can emerge. When this sentiment fails to make itself known to others, the person who seems to lack it is perceived as a monster. And I have how can I move forward here? Here's the French passage together with the English translation. So the point here is that if you look at someone and the someone seems to lack something that enables you to share into this person's sentiments and feelings, this person is perceived as a monster, but then apparently also becomes a monster. And there's a slide here, and I have an explanation for why there is this slide, but I will skip over it because of reasons of time here. So the crucial point is that there is this sentiment that is lacking and that is perceived to be lacking. And that is the basis for the judgment that someone is a monster. Bouffier uses a cluster of related terms when talking about the sentiment that aligns humans in their thoughts and feelings, and thereby enables agreement and judgment. In the traité, he calls it the sentiment de genre humain. Hang on, I need to. Sentiment de genre humain, other times the sentiment commun à tous les hommes, or the sentiment de la nature. Curiously, when first referring to the sentiment commun de la nature, Bouffier notes that it can also be called le sens commun. This formulation is irritating because Bouffier never clarifies if the sens commun produces the sentiment or rather expresses itself in it. And what follows, I will treat the sens commun in the first sense, that is as a disposition that generates the above-mentioned sentiments, which I will call sentiment humain for being just to have a technical term here. For Bouffier, all humans share the sens commun through their species membership. It enables them to form judgments that count as common and uniform because other people naturally tend to agree with them. Okay. All right, so I might just read the English one. Thus, I understand here by common sense the disposition that nature has placed in all humans, or clearly in most of them, when they have attained the age and use of reason, to pass a common and uniform judgment regarding objects different from the intimate sentiment of their own perception, a judgment that is not the consequent of any prior principle. The underlying thought that connects Bouffier's reflections on the sens commun with his conception of reason relates to the thought standardizing function of the sentiment humain. If there were no shared human sentiments guiding humans in their thinking, Bouffier argues, everyone would engage in the individual practice of thought and, quote, le genre humain ne sera qu'un amas de visionnaires. Contrasting this visionary state of humanity with the well-ordered dispositions of reasonable minds, Bouffier maintains, il est dans les hommes quelque chose qui s'appelle raison et qui est opposé à l'extravagance. So let me just give you the French quotes here. Okay. So I just read the first two. All in all, Bouffier thus suggests that for humans, the ability to experience the sentiment humain is absolutely fundamental. Without it, they would not have reason, but only a random array of thoughts that would fail to garner approval and accord. Importantly, as stated in the passage from the traité, there is nothing over and above this sentiment-based principle of thought. So he says, d'aucun principe d'intérieur in this longer passage that could organize human reason. This is because what renders a thought reasonable just is its compliance with a principle that we can feel to accord with through the sentiment humain. And this is the third passage. Dans la nature des hommes, il est un principe qui se fait sentir. Thoughts that follow this principle are thoughts generated through the use of reason, and because of this count as reasonable. Le raisonnement toujours suppose un principe. One may agree or disagree with this conception of reason. What is interesting about it is that Bouffier quite consistently thinks of the individual mind from the perspective of the human species. For him, it only makes sense to speak of a mind as reasonable if this mind is capable of aligning itself with the principles that other members of the species also accept as structuring reason. Note that this last point is conceptual rather than epistemological. This is because reasonableness is defined by the views that human beings naturally share on the basis of how their natural sentiments affect them. Further specifying what this reasonableness involves, he writes that the sentiment humain renders humans prudent and allows them to have good sense. Epistemic terms like evidence and proof are also comprehended through their connection with the sentiment common to all. Characterizing what renders a proof plausible, Bouffier states that, quote, le plausible, that's the last one, the plausible est au fond que ce qui touche la raison humaine par voie de sentiment. He thereby highlights once again the sentimental aspect of what it means to judge reasonably. To explain how this sentiment is able to provide evidence for what is the case, he writes that it is, quote, imprimé dans l'esprit de tous les hommes, and makes it, quote, impossible de juger autrement. So it makes it impossible to judge otherwise. A consequence of Bouffier's account is that it in principle invalidates reflections on the reasonableness of one human being in isolation from the sentiments of others. This is because for him, the conception of the human mind as a reasonable mind, which is a mind that is in possession of reason, requires to think of it in relation to a community of thinkers who all relate to the world in broadly similar ways. Beyond this shared human perspective, there's no room for reasonableness, for the concept of reasonableness becomes meaningless when detached from the way humans collectively think and feel. For the individual mind itself, this concretely means that it cannot self-identify as reasonable if it fails to accept that others exist as cognitive equals, that is, as beings who are endowed with the same kind of rational and sentimental capacities as the self. There's an additional argument to this, and it relates to Bouffier's list of first truth. And the first truth actually is that we have to accept the other, but I can't go into this, but there's more to explore here. So I'll now turn to Hume. With these conceptual distinctions in hand, let us return to Hume's uncouth monster passage in which he describes himself as, quote, foreseeing on every side dispute, contradiction, anger, calumny, and detraction, unquote. What seems to render him monstrous in the eyes of others is that his thoughts do not resonate with their well-established beliefs, so that they conceive of him as someone deprived of the degree of reason characteristic of normal human beings. What renders him monstrous from his own perspective is that he cannot self-identify as a mind capable of rational thought. Quote, every step I take is with hesitation, and every new reflection makes me dread an error and absurdity in my reasoning. At odds with the views of others, he has nothing to hold on to when his own doubts take over and confront him with the absurdity of successively assenting to the many manifest contradictions that have, quote, heated his brain, unquote, over the course of his reflections. Strikingly, in Book 3, Hume keeps thinking of contradiction and the lack of agreement with other people as a fundamentally destabilizing influence on the mind that, if left unaddressed, would render impossible any kind of reasonable discourse. It is impossible we could ever converse together on any reasonable terms were each of us to consider characters and persons only as they appear from his peculiar point of view. In order, therefore, to prevent those continual contradictions and arrive at a more stable judgment of things, we fix on some steady and general points of view. A class of judgments Hume is concerned with here are moral judgments. They assess the merits of a person's character, and as such constitute a specific subclass of judgments. Instead of judging the features of objects like triangles or towers, they evaluate durable character traits of persons. Despite this difference concerning the object of judgment and the features attributed to them, so like size or color in one case and virtue or bias in the other, what they have in common is that interpersonal agreement forms a central characteristic of both types of judgment. For what judgments ideally provide us with are not evaluations of what a thing or character looks like from one's personal point of view, but what the thing or character in question can be said to be. Judges can, in principle, agree on the latter, but not on the former, which implies that if judges remain caught up in the subjective perspective without moving on to a stable and general point of view, they are faced with contradictions and cannot participate in reasonable discourse. Without being able to fully argue this point here, it is important to stress that the kind of agreement that is at stake in Hume's account of moral judgment does not necessarily require that judges hold perfectly identical views, only that there is a basic understanding of the principles of judgment underlying the belief that is communicated. In the Inquiry, he makes this point more forcefully than in the treatise. He here still demands that individuals must depart from their personal point of view in order to participate in moral discourse, but he adds that they do so when speaking, quote unquote, a language that can be understood by everyone. Bestowing, quote, the epithets of vicious or odious or depraved, man expresses sentiments in which he expects all his audience to concur with him, unquote. In order to feel these sentiments, man must, quote, depart from his private and particular situation and must choose a point of view common to him with others. He must move some universal principle of the human frame and touch a string to which all mankind have an accord and symphony, unquote. By invoking the importance of language, Hume emphasizes the need for a specific type of understanding, one that involves semantic skills as well as the more general ability to make sense of what is being communicated. This can be done by drawing on shared principles of judgment, which are shared insofar as they resonate with a sentiment that Hume takes to be common to all, and that thereby enables humans to organize their thoughts in similar ways. It is this kind of resonance of agreement that I believe Hume has in mind when he speaks about conquering with the opinions of others. It involves a sentiment-based understanding of the relevant principles of judgment without requiring others to have identical views. In the previous section, we saw that for Bouffier, reasonable thought follows a universal principle grounded in the sentiment humain. This sentiment is common to all humans and affects their minds in such a way that they think along similar lines and reach similar conclusions. Moreover, Bouffier argues that without the guidance of this sentiment that standardizes human thought, we would be constantly derailed, stray into speculative realms, and become victims of extravagance, absurdity, ridicule, and even folly. Strikingly, Hume uses many of these terms in the context of the uncouth monster passage. He speaks of himself as deformed through the, quote, disorder of his faculties, unquote. And he talks about his splenetic humor when considering enduring from metaphysical speculation and the ridiculous views that false and extravagant philosophy produces by yielding to the, quote, current of nature in submitting to his senses and intellect, unquote. Yet where Hume comes closest to Bouffier is in his account of moral judgment. He here construes reasonableness as requiring agreement and accord, and claims that sentiment functions as a principle that influences thought in a uniform way, thereby standardizing procedures of judgment across different people. According to this account, the purpose of reflection is to organize the judge's own perspective in relation to the perspective that others have on the character to be judged. It does so by surveying and integrating sympathetically shared perspectives of differently situated people. Kind of reasonableness he refers to here arises from this reflective process and need not, but can, under certain circumstances, involve the use of reason and its demonstrative and probabilistic function. Clearly, this book 3 conception of reflection is very different from the conception that turns problematic at the end of book 1. Book 3 reflection does not detach the mind from the, quote, regular flowing of the passions and sentiments, unquote, as metaphysical book 1 reflection does. As we've seen, Hume calls this form of reflection forced and unnatural, and thinks of it as the hallmark of a monstrous mind. A mind that, as Bouffier argues, and Hume seems to agree, appears to lack the rational and sentimental capacities that humans are able to recognize in each other as the capacities of normally functioning human beings. By contrast, book 3 reflection activates the natural disposition to tune in with feelings common to all human beings. It thereby enables the guiding influence of a shared sentimental disposition that is constitutively involved in the production of the kind of reasonableness that comes into play when we understand the grounds for another person's judgment. How am I doing in time? Can't see us. Let me just.
Minutes.
Need to finish?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Conclusion. To be sure, there are many differences between Hume's and Bouffier's account of judgment. Despite these differences, however, it is important to recognize Bouffier's influence on Hume, for it can sharpen our view for something that has often been overlooked. That is, that Hume continued to operate with a positive concept of judgment even after the skeptical debacle of book 1. This concept is grounded in the idea that reasonableness cannot be had if approached from the perspective of a solitary mind. The reason for this is, and here Bouffier's influence on Hume asserts itself most prominently, that reasonableness arises when people find agreement as a result of sentiment-driven process of thought. On this account, sentiment plays the key role of standardizing thought. Without this standardization, minds go off in different directions and lose the capacity to self-identify as reasonable. The paradigmatic example of a mind departing from standardized process of thought is the monstrous mind. It's monstrous for precisely the reason that it fails to align with the feelings and thoughts of others, a feature which makes it deficient when regarded from the point of view of what is natural and normal for the members of the human species. Engaging with Hume's famous uncouth monster passage thus puts a spotlight on these connections, suggesting that Hume's theory of moral judgment is based on assumptions that are relevant to ordinary epistemic judgments as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Anik. And let's go to the next paper tonight. Our next speaker is Charles Goldhaber with the title Abstract on Hume's Reaches. Charles, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be on this panel. I really respect everyone else who is presenting today, and it's nice to get to share some of the commonalities in our research. I have a handout for today, which I'm going to link to in the chat. In case anyone's watching on YouTube and wants to follow along with the handout, you go to cgoldhaber.com/PBS for Princeton-Bucharest seminar. And if you want to see how to spell my name, I'm going to stop my video very briefly. Hopefully it should show up. If it doesn't, it's cgoldhaber.com/PBS. Right. So I will just do
Charles,
it.
if you want to write it down in the chat, I can post it on the YouTube.
Okay, yeah, it's in the chat. I just put it again. All right, yeah, so I'll do this somewhat old-fashioned and read from a paper, but there's enough commonality, I think, in the handout that you can follow along. So this paper is called Hume's Real Riches, and I'll just get started. Yeah, so in essays entitled The Epicurean, The Stoic, The Platonist, and The Skeptic, Hume impersonates characters that he associates with the four Hellenistic sects just mentioned, and goes on to exhibit their different perspectives on human happiness and the proper object of the will. So in the last of these essays, Hume's skeptic, his imagined skeptic, denies that there is any one such object, but declares instead, to be happy, the passion must be cheerful and gay, not gloomy and melancholy. A propensity to hope and joy is real riches, one to fear and sorrow real poverty. So my goal today will be to explain and justify this statement. So if you take only two things away from the talk, I hope that they're these. First, that cheerfulness is a special virtue for Hume. And second, that thinking about cheerfulness is useful and perhaps crucial for thinking about Hume's relationship to both Stoicism and to skepticism regarding practical matters. So in past work, especially a paper which Margaret already plugged, thank you, called The Humors for Hume's Skepticism, I've argued that Hume conceives of skepticism in terms of the melancholic temperament of classical medicine, which is a gloomy, solitary temperament full of doubts and fears. So what's a temperament? A temperament is, among other things, a disposition to have certain passions. And if we help ourselves to Hume's theory of sympathy, to communicate those passions to others. So someone of a cheerful temperament tends to feel positive emotions such as hope, joy, and love, and is encouraged to take notice of and pursue all sorts of innocent pleasures. Cheerfulness, Hume tells us, lends sprightliness to the cheerful person's countenance, discourse, and behavior, inspires jovial talk and pleasant entertainment, and diffuses a joy over the whole company of people around her. Even a dejected melancholic, he says, infuses a sensible complacency and serenity from a cheerful face. For Hume, in my view, cheerfulness is the opposite of and proper cure for melancholy and for the excessive skepticism which he associates with melancholy. Today, I want to explain what Hume's cheerfulness is, drawing out both key similarities and key differences from Stoic tranquility. I'll conclude with some reflections on philosophy's role in promoting a happy life by safeguarding cheerfulness. Ultimately, I think Hume agrees with his skeptic's assessment of the importance of cheerfulness for a happy life, but disagrees with her pessimism about philosophy's contribution. So let me start then by arguing that Hume agrees with his skeptic about the great value of cheerfulness. In the essay, My Own Life, Hume describes his own social, open and cheerful humor as, quote, a turn of mind which it is more happy to possess than to be born to an estate of 10,000 a year. And I think the context helps us see why he would say this. I mean, Hume tells us that his short autobiography is little more than a history of his writings, but the focus is almost, well, there's a great focus on their successes or more often failures in public reception. So apart from the political discourses, which he deems the only work of his that was successful in first publication, and perhaps the middle volumes of the History of England, which produced tolerable but only tolerable success, Hume's works received either silence or derision upon initial printing. His treatise, for example, he says, fell dead-born from the press, while his cherished second enquiry, quote, came unnoticed and unobserved into the world. Worse yet, the Natural History of Religion suffered a, quote, pamphlet against it, full of illiberal petulance, arrogance, and scurrility. And the first volume of the history was assailed by, quote, English, Scotch, and Irish, Whig and Tory, churchman and secretary, freethinker and religionist, patriot and courtier, all united in their rage against the man who had presumed to shed a generous tear for the fate of Charles I and the Earl of Strafford. Though by the end of Hume's life, he had seen a favorable shift in public reception, the overall impression he paints is a life, quote, not such as to be the object of envy. Why does Hume go into so much detail about his failures? The answer, I think, is not just that he wanted to pass on to posterity an accurate account of his reception, nor that he was exacting a bitter revenge. I think it's instead to provide a backdrop to exhibit a feature of his character that he valued more than fame or fortune. So many commentators have drawn attention to Hume's love of literary fame, which he here describes as his ruling passion. But I think they miss that Hume's point in invoking his love of literary fame is to emphasize that even this persistent passion, quote, never soured his temper, notwithstanding his frequent disappointments. The reason it did not, apparently, was the very temper itself. Even after the disaster of the treatise's initial reception, or reception in his whole life, Hume, being naturally of a cheerful and sanguine temper, very soon recovered the blow and prosecuted with great ardor his studies in the country. Though many would be discouraged by failing to achieve their most cherished aim after years of preparation, Hume was not, or at least not very long. He says, such is the force of natural temper that these disappointments made little or no impression on me. It's then unsurprising that cheerfulness would receive approbation. And it does in many of other Hume's texts. So in the history, Hume admires Mary Queen of Scots, bearing a, quote, cheerful and even smiling countenance in the face of execution, and Queen Anne Boleyn's behaving herself with her usual serenity and even with cheerfulness at her own beheading by Henry VIII. In the second enquiry, an admirer of Cleanthes, Hume's virtue superhero, to borrow a phrase from oh goodness, sorry, I'm blanking on who said it, but I'll maybe come back to that later. So an admirer of Cleanthes, anyways, emphasizes that his cheerfulness is not a flash struck out by company. It runs through the whole tenor of his life and preserves a perpetual serenity on his countenance and tranquility in his soul. It was Amy Schmitter, that's who said it. Anyway, so, well, cheerfulness, it begets esteem or carries a great merit foremost by bringing joy and other agreeable emotion to its possessors, and through sympathy to others. But we might also add that it helps other virtues manifest. In Hume's own case, cheerfulness allowed him to remain industrious even throughout the many unhappy accidents of his life. Insofar as cheerfulness allows one to put one's other talents to good use, it bears some resemblance to wisdom in Plato or the perfectly good will in Kant. Cheerfulness thus seems to enjoy a kind of priority above the other virtues, which it enables or at least safeguards against the exigencies of life. So all of these figures, Mary, Anne, Cleanthes, and even Hume himself, can look a little bit like Stoic sages. They are mostly undisturbed by misfortune, especially that which results from the turbulent, foolish bustle of human concern. We might imagine them dwelling, as Hume's Stoic in the essay The Stoic puts it, within the temple of wisdom, seated on a rock above the rage of the fighting elements and inaccessible to all the malice of men. The Stoic sage is here pictured as deeply withdrawn. She finds no role for external goods, like fame or riches, nor for pursuit in them in her life, since these things are perishable and in some measure beyond control. Happiness cannot possibly exist where there is no security, she says, and security can have no place where fortune has any dominion. She finds security only in an internally controllable good, the activity of self-perfection, and this is to be achieved through philosophical reflection. Hume's association of cheerfulness with tranquility and serenity, especially against misfortune, suggests a comparison with the Stoic. But his consistent criticism of the Stoic quest for self-perfection challenges it. Hume laughs at the ineffectuality of Stoic fortification for a person lying under the racking pains of the gout. Worse than ineffectual, though, the Stoic endeavor to confine our pleasures altogether within our minds, Hume says, may lead us to reason ourselves out of all virtue as well as social enjoyment. For Hume, the Stoics' tranquilizing of the passions removes natural sympathy, producing reprehensible, even inhuman results. Epictetus, Hume explains in the essay of Moral Prejudices, advises us to counterfeit a sympathy with a friend in affliction if it give him relief, but to take care not to allow any compassion to sink into your heart or disturb that tranquility, which is the perfection of wisdom. But for Hume, our friends' misfortunes should touch us. We should, through natural sympathy, feel some share of their grief. Epictetus's recommended apathy and dishonesty, on the other hand, should strike us as bizarre and disgusting. If cheerfulness is to avoid Hume's criticism of the Stoic tranquility, we need some way to understand how the two differ. I think we can find some help in Hume's talk of real riches. Hume uses this phrase exactly once more in his corpus in the essay of Commerce. There, Hume says that the happiness and defense of a state or nation are largely united with regard to trade and manufacture. Commerce promotes happiness by incentivizing people to produce food in excess of subsistence needs in order to afford luxuries. They then become more hardworking and productive. And this personal industry, being useful and agreeable, directly promotes the population's virtue and happiness, while also allowing people to afford more luxuries to take pleasure in. I think Margaret Watkins' discussion of this in her book on the essays and a chapter called Industry is really revealing how important it is to Hume. But then there's also another side, which I want to emphasize here, which is that commerce promotes defense as well by producing what Hume calls superfluous labor, for example, in the form of a public granary of corn or a magazine of arms. This stored labor is ready and waiting for protection against unhappy accidents. It is here that Hume calls trade and industry, conceived of as a stock of labor, real riches. They are real riches because they in times of peace and tranquility, as is Hume, are employed for the ease and satisfaction of individuals, but in the exigencies of state may in part be turned to public advantage. So the analogy with commerce, I think, helps bring out how cheerfulness differs from Stoic tranquility. Like a commercial population, and unlike a Stoic sage, a cheerful person expects pleasures in all sorts of external goods and is motivated to pursue them industriously. Her happiness comes largely through her pursuit of those goods. Like commerce, cheerfulness also fortifies us against misfortune, but again, in an importantly different way than Stoic tranquility does. Just as a well-prepared nation may suffer losses in a surprise attack, yet soon be ready to launch a counteroffensive, a cheerful person may feel the sharpness of a disappointment, yet like Hume, bounce back quickly without despairing of success in her endeavors. Neither are like the Stoic sage, unaffected. And in some cases, the harsh passions suffered will be a sign of the state's or person's humanity, as when a population mourns a national tragedy or a cheerful person sheds a tear for a friend who has lost a loved one. Moreover, both the commercial nation and the cheerful person's responses require a shift in resources or a kind of engagement. Communal stockhouses and individual wealth can, through legislation or taxation, be transferred to the war effort, and individual hope can be spent exploring new avenues, as Hume did when he shifted literary styles to a degree between the treatise and the essays. Though these shifts can be quick, they will not generally be instant, nor will the resources be endless. Like a stock of labor, a cheerful disposition can be exhausted by long sieges of misfortune. Cheerfulness is thus a less heroic, but also less mythical and more humane and more human analog to Stoic tranquility. It is engagement rather than withdrawal, strength of mind rather than apathy, resilience rather than immunity, and alacrity rather than immutability. Hume's most forceful remarks against the utility of philosophy for living well are couched within his critique of Stoicism. But in the virtue of cheerfulness, he evidently wanted to rescue some grain of truth from Stoic thought and to humanize it. We might wonder then whether he might also rescue philosophical reflection. If he does, then he must disagree with his skeptic's denial that it is in a man's power to correct his temper. The skeptic says, if we can depend on any principle which we learn from philosophy, this, I think, must be considered as certain and undoubted, that there is nothing in itself valuable or despicable, desirable or hateful, beautiful or deformed, but that these attributes arise from the particular constitution and fabric of human sentiment and affection. What affects the feeling of one with delight produces uneasiness in another. The skeptic goes on to exploit these findings in two related arguments against the utility of philosophy. In the first, she considers a whole host of philosophical maxims, of which most have a Stoical lineage. Maxim by maxim, the skeptic explains how each could be taken in such a way that it destroys rather than promotes happiness or virtue. She then concludes that philosophy cannot be medicine of the mind, but this rests on a misunderstanding about the nature of medicine. A medicine must be tailored to a patient's particular constitution. It need not heal everyone. The skeptic's second argument replies that while philosophical reflection can be salutary to certain tempers, only the already virtuous will be moved by them, whereas the vicious are left cold or made worse. Thus, philosophy can only heal the already healthy and so is useless. This reply too misunderstands medicine, which can not only restore but maintain health. It also exhibits dichotomous thinking. Between the absolutely virtuous and the absolutely vicious lies the great part of humanity, many of whom may be able to a degree to improve themselves through philosophical reflection. Thus, Hume suggests that the skeptic carries the matters too far in ignoring a whole host of philosophical maxims whose truth is undeniable and whose natural tendency is to tranquilize and soften all the passions. Here we can start to understand Hume's position on the value of philosophy, of skepticism, and of his 4 essays on happiness for producing happiness itself. Hume thinks that some philosophy can instill virtuous passion by painting virtue in the most amiable colors, borrowing all the helps from poetry and eloquence, and treating their subject in an easy and obvious manner as such as is best fitted to please the imagination and engage the affections. But just how Hume's 4 essays on happiness are supposed to do that is not cut and dry. They may very well regulate our sentiments by placing opposite characters in proper contrast. But if they do not simply do so by making virtue's beauty stand out in contrast to vice's repulsiveness. All the characters can in turn seem both appealing and misguided, and accepting a few points of agreement give incompatible advice. It may very well be that Hume hoped his readers would consider the topic unfinished and find room to develop their conclusions, perhaps by reconciling or rejecting strands within each essay. But these essays may work on the passions in yet another way, by producing a sense of perplexity or inability to choose, and relatedly, a sense of philosophy's own limitations. This kind of humiliation, which Hume takes to be the lesson of skeptical philosophy, can, he tells us, abate the pride of those inclined from their natural temper to haughtiness and obstinacy. And in the moral realm, it may help philosophers develop an awareness of, quote, not only the narrowness of their understandings, but also of their passions and predominant inclinations, to which their other desires and affections submit. If each of Hume's 4 philosophical characters appears to tell part of the truth, experience of all 4 may broaden a reader's passions and temper her predominant inclination. This could, I think, promote the reader's understanding of and readiness to sympathize with others whose priorities in life might have otherwise seemed too lax or too meticulous or misguided in some other way. So in tempering our arrogance, skeptical philosophy protects our cheerfulness in particular from calcifying into the vice of immodesty. Philosophy thus helps us live happy lives, both by maintaining the real riches of our cheerfulness and by promoting cohesion in the diverse liberal society which Hume thought the modern era made possible. So skepticism about philosophy's practicality is then one way philosophy can be practical and help us live well. And that's the talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good timing. I'm very impressed by all speakers tonight, how wonderful they kept time. So therefore we have plenty of time for questions. Please do show your, either raise hand or write in the chat what is the subject of your question so that I can act as a moderator. We do have a raised hand. Kate Abramson. Can you perhaps show yourself as well? Yes.
Sorry. Zoom has made me infinitely self-conscious.
Oh, you're muted now.
You are muted for some reason.
Can you hear me now? Sorry. I was just saying this Zoom has made me infinitely self-conscious, which is why I hide. There's nothing like having to stare at yourself in these things. And hello to a bunch of people I haven't seen in a very long time. So I actually had 2 quick questions for Charles. One is, I was a little surprised given that the question is Hume's use of Stoicism, specifically with regard to things like the character of Cleanthes that we find in the second inquiry, that you went to cheerfulness rather than to what's always seemed to me the echo here, which is greatness of mind, magnitudonomy. There's a whole section on it in the treatise where Hume is, and there's a natural source for that, right? Hume is, in points in that section, he actually quotes Cicero, right? He quotes De Officiis, which we all know he had open on his lap. And De Officiis is the appropriation of Stoicism for everyday life. So I was a little bit surprised that you went for cheerfulness rather than this other explicitly marked virtue. And then the other thing is just a more general question. Some of the questions that you were asking about the skeptic puzzled me, in part because it seemed like another natural way to answer them was to notice that there's a character in the footnotes of that essay who's arguing with the skeptic, right? And saying, the skeptic perhaps goes a bit too far. Surely that's at least as much Hume's voice as the character in the essay. Or we have no reason to think not. Yes, the cat thinks I'm.
Yeah, good.
Right, so that's all. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll try to take both of those, or answer both of those questions in sort of one fell swoop. So the way that I'll do that is by noting that I think that cheerfulness, which Hume does explicitly state as a virtue in a few places, once in the treatise and a little bit more in the second inquiry, I think is his kind of replacement for a virtue that he thinks maybe kind of exceeds normal human life. Part of why I think of this is, well, this is not exactly magnanimity, but with strength of mind, Hume is quite clear that he thinks that nobody human can carry this virtue to the point where it will really be able to be used in all circumstances whatsoever. And his response to the Stoics often have that tint to them. He tries to show, like, look, in this really extreme circumstance, or maybe not even that extreme. Gout is very painful, but it's recognizable in this sort of circumstance. We just really can't expect the Stoic to be, or we can't really expect someone to.
No, that's all right. That's all true. And some of his examples. Yeah. Sorry, I just jump into because to agree and then disagree, right? I mean, so one of his examples about that, one of the ones that I find funniest is that he makes fun of them by offering Medea as an example of the true sublime, which I've always found hilarious. But he says all the things that you're saying about about that in the section on greatness of mind, right? About this virtue being too fine, and then he invokes, the mistakes that of thinking of Alexander as someone of true greatness, right? So I get it. Yeah, he says all of that, but it seems to me that this is something that he associates not with cheerfulness, which is of course a virtue for Hume, understood in a very particular way, but something that he associates with his version, his democratized, tamed version of greatness of mind.
Yeah, I guess I'll have to think about this a little more to be able to answer you satisfyingly. I guess I think it's rather striking the way that he talks about cheerfulness. It's so often in the context of cases where it seems to rescue us from being taken down by misfortune. And I mean, I think this throughout all of his writing, that's where it shows up more than just the sort of pleasant conversation. So I guess I should ask myself later whether he thinks that these virtues or that greatness of mind is sort of a part of cheerfulness, or they're at least closely related. I don't really have an answer to that. I have a thought about the second part of your question, but I think I should maybe leave the floor to other people.
Yeah, we have a list of people. I would like to remind you that maybe if you have a question to the point, raise a finger or right finger in the chat, or if you have a different question, then just signal that it's a different question. I do have a finger on this point. Charles,
Okay.
you know, a question coming from someone who doesn't know really Hume, but everything you were saying about cheerfulness reminded me of another Stoic virtue that might be put as a footnote somewhere in your talk, which has been translated by joy. It's gaudium, and it's one of the important virtues for Seneca, which I mean, when you were talking about cheerfulness, I was kind of thinking that maybe that's what Hume is talking about. Letter 23 and 58 of Seneca's letters to Julius are talking about this gaudium.
Good. Yeah. So, oh, sorry. Do you have more? Okay.
I don't know whether that's relevant. You might want to comment on this or
yeah, that seems worth exploring. I mean, maybe that's a better word for the aspect of Stoicism that Hume is trying to humanize and transfigure and make his own. I think he wouldn't use that term since he treats joy typically as a passion, and cheerfulness is a character trait or temperament. And he maybe wants to create some sort of distinction between those, although he's not perfectly consistent with these things. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, actually, that's the point is that this gaudium in Seneca is not actually Stoic, is a twist on the Stoicism, which attempts to take it into the direction in which he's saying that there is more to the tranquility of the mind, and there is something which relates to the external form of our philosophical way of being into the world and so on. And then it has all sorts of interesting features that reminded me of your description of Hume's cheerfulness.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll reach out for suggestions for good passages. Thank you.
Right. Question from Daniel Garber.
First of all, I want to thank all four of you for what was a really, really interesting session. But I have a particular question for Margaret. You're interested in why it is that Hume doesn't go more deeply into sort of the physiology behind all of these notions that he's talking about. And I was a little surprised that you didn't consider Locke in this regard. Locke begins the essay, of course, by saying, well, my purpose is to inquire into the original certainty and extent of human knowledge, blah, blah, blah. I shall not at present meddle with the physical consideration of the mind or trouble myself to examine what its essence consists in, by what motions of our spirits, alterations of our bodies, we come to have any sensation in our organs, etc. And this is, I think, an extremely interesting, and he does go back on that from time to time, most notably in Book 2, Chapter 8, where he talks about primary and secondary qualities, where he says, I've maybe gone a little bit too far into physics, but it looks to me as if he is trying to reorient philosophy in a certain sense away from, say, what Descartes was doing in the Passions of the Soul, where he says explicitly, I'm talking en physicien, as a natural philosopher. It seems to me that Locke is outlining a different kind of project. And I've always read Hume as, in a certain sense, attempting to work within that broad framework that Locke had set out. Now, of course, what Hume is doing, in the treatise and other writings, is much broader than what it is that Locke was doing in the essay. But even so, I was surprised you didn't consider that as a possible source of Hume's attitudes toward those sorts of physiological explanations.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's very helpful. I guess I would say the guiding question of my paper is not so much why is Hume not going into the physiology more deeply as why does he occasionally lapse into it, despite, I think, that he shares that guiding principle with Locke. And yet the contrast with, in a longer version of the paper, I draw up the contrast with Descartes, which is really powerful, because Descartes was so confident about the progress of medicine, and Hume's own context was so interested in the progress of medicine. And so, I mean, I do think that it's interesting that both Hume and Locke share, I don't know if it's fair to say Locke has a suspicion of that project. I think Hume actually does. So given that, whence these references to the animal spirits and the humors in the treatise. So I think that's why I didn't, I wasn't looking for sort of an explanation of why Hume is not interested in the anatomy, but it's certainly a helpful correlation to think about.
Can you say a little bit more about the parts of your paper on Descartes that you didn't talk about?
Yeah, so I mean, I've just been really struck in teaching the discourse, how crucial the medical project is to what Descartes is doing, and how widely I think that is not understood. And I mean, Hume is very cognizant of the influence of Descartes, and that influence was, as I'm sure most of you know, I mean, it was strongly dependent on that medical project. I mean, the way that Descartes talks about the possibilities of extending life, and the way that he describes health as the sort of first and primary good in section 6, I think, of the discourse. I mean,
I'm not sure I believe him about that.
But it depends on how,
That's another matter.
Yeah, I mean, are we grateful for his frankness or not, I think, is the question. I'm not. But I mean, I do think that he had a kind of confidence in the ability of medicine to progress. And I don't see that in Hume, despite the fact that there was certainly progression in the mechanical sciences, if not in medicine per se, between Descartes and Hume. And I think that's really, really interesting. I think you see that all over the place, sort of even when he's praising Newton in the history, he's praising his skepticism, And so, I mean, there's, or what Hume sees as Newton's skepticism. So that's part of what I was thinking about, contrasting the confidence that Descartes has in this kind of progress with what seems to me Hume's deep suspicion of it.
Well, I actually am reading it in a slightly different way, which is that earlier in the 17th century, the Locke represents, in a certain sense, a step toward a very different conception of what the philosophical enterprise is. And in particular, a conception in which natural philosophy is no longer an integral part of the philosophical enterprise. And he presents himself quite explicitly, not only this passage, but also the underlaborer passage in the letter, the introductory letter, is suggesting a different conception of philosophy that will, I think, ultimately lead to the split between physics, natural philosophy, and medicine on the one hand, and what becomes the philosophical enterprise later on in the 18th and into the 19th century. And in a certain sense, it seems like Hume is close enough to the 17th century conception that I think it may be very difficult for him not to, from time to time, even though he's not a physician, the way in which, or a natural philosopher, the way in which somebody like Descartes and many of his contemporaries thought of themselves as. But that's a little different way of seeing the connection, but probably complementary to what it is that you were suggesting.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have more to say, but I want to let other people ask questions. So.
Martin's next question.
Yes, I'm on now. Well, thanks to all of you so far. So I have a question for Anique and Charles, and what makes me bring them together is that you both seem to be working away from melancholy or the uncouth monster passage. Anique in a sort of more explicit way, but Charles, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but Charles in presenting cheerfulness as a sort of contrary to the melancholic state that Locke finds himself in. So I just want to briefly say how I see sort of your approaches, and then ask perhaps 1.5 questions, as it were. So it seems, so first zooming in on what Anique says, it seems, especially in relying on Bouffier, you say that without this sort of human sentiment, there was this passage that our mind would just be an array of thoughts. So ultimately, it seems like the sentiment humain is fundamental, and without it, there would be no such thing as reason. And it thus seems that reason is basically grounded in sociability, in being with others. And you can read then sort of Hume's, if you then move on to Hume from that perspective, it seems that the melancholy, the uncouth monster state is coming out not just out of the skepticism, but out of as it were, out of an epistemic doubt, but out of the despair triggered by loneliness, by being apart from others, being alienated, and being alienating to others. So that's how I take your reading, and especially in relation to Bouffier. I don't know whether that's sort of appropriate, but that's what I take away from it. So ultimately, what goes wrong for Hume in the uncouth monster status is being apart from others, and being alienated from others, and then just having this sort of array of thoughts that go nowhere. And now onto Charles. So I wonder then if cheerfulness or whatever, we had sort of other candidates, for instance, by Kate Emerson, sort of, so whatever you call it, but this state that you bring out as cheerfulness, as a contrary to that melancholy. I would wonder whether that passion is ultimately, or has to be ultimately, sort of socially induced as well, via modes of sympathy or whatever, such that sort of on the level of emotions, this state of cheerfulness would be at root a social emotion that also requires being with others. And indeed, that's of course how Hume famously resolves his own despair. He dines and has a game of backgammon and so on. And that's sort of what cools the temperament and ultimately leads to a different status. So I'm just wondering whether then the binding or the link between your two accounts is really that there's a sort of pendulum movement between being apart from others versus being in company.
Okay, maybe I'll answer first. So there's a part of this paper that connects the uncouth monster passage with the chapter Skepticism with regard to reason, and especially focusing on nature, what is natural and normal. So I haven't really talked about this today. And the whole conception of the monster, which is highly problematic. And I should say that you know, got to be careful here how you put things. But the way it's used, the beginning of the 18th century. So if you see it in the context of the debate, also the natural and anatomical debate, sort of really goes at this notion of what is natural for the species. It's sort of delineating the difference between humans and animals, and then also in the Lockean sense, so saying what is it that we can attribute to a species? Is that just on the basis of qualities that we perceive and experience, and we lack knowledge of their essences? So this is kind of all working in the background. So this idea of saying something about what the human being is and what is normal for this human being. So it's not just being with other people. I think that is something that is stronger in Bouffier, but it ties in with his nominalism, that he says, okay, how is it that we can, and you know, it's kind of tricky and sort of going in a few roundabouts way from saying, what can we know? So how can we know the inner constitution of things? Well, we don't know the essence of things. What's the best bet we have? There is this sentiment. We can agree on certain forms of judgment. Let's make sense of the world in terms of that. If someone can't tune in, someone is out, someone is totally incomprehensible to all others, where the problematic part comes in, right? Then we cannot, let's put it, we cannot recognize this other person as a creature who has the same type of reason that we usually agree on as being the normal type of reason for human beings. Okay, so and then going back to this notion of what is normal and natural for human beings, connecting it up with 141 in the treatise, it's what is natural is actually a form of reasoning that resonates with sentiment. So there, these passages were, you know, talk as if it feels good, it resonates with the passions, with the sentiments, it's easy, it's not force, and in that sense, it's not leading you into those metaphysical speculations. And that interestingly ties in with talk about extravagance, folly. This is quite a commonplace in those debates, not just in Bouffier and Hume, but also in others. Okay, so it's not just about agreement, social agreement. It kind of really sits in this space between thinking about the human species, having this natural philosophical kind of take on things, but also combines with skepticism, because if you combine it with the nominalism debate, you can clearly see where the focus on sentiment is coming from. It is a little bit of a hand-waving position.
Right, I see, thanks. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll answer quickly. I don't think that for Hume, it's a necessary enabling condition to be in company to have cheerfulness. And I think this comes out in the discussion of Cleanthes. I'll just put a quote in the chat. So cheerfulness is not a sudden flash struck out by company. It runs through the whole tenor of its life. And it comes out particularly in also, it's maybe shows its true colors when you're when you're facing misfortune. I mean, Anne Boleyn in the locked away in a tower awaiting execution is supposed to be cheerful for Hume. And that's, I mean, it's remarkable, but it's that having been said, the connection with sociability is really crucial and strong for Hume, and that's why I think that's why I want to say at the end of the paper that if skeptical philosophy can help us be more sociable by destroying our arrogance, it actually can protect our cheerfulness, because it gives us better situations for that that virtue to manifest.
Great, thanks. I think Donald has a finger on this. I read in the
It's actually me.
Anna, you're muted.
Okay.
Donald, just go ahead.
You ready for me?
Yep.
Okay. I just want to I want to get clear on Anik's view of how the sentiment of humanity, which is, not something that occurs in the treatise. The phrase doesn't occur in the treatise, is supposed to make sense of his account of reasoning in the treatise. Like it seemed like you wanted to have this requirement of sort of a social seconding of our reasoning in order for the reasoning to count as reasoning at all. Now Hume thinks the mind is pretty thoroughly social throughout the treatise, in the very way that our thought is structured by language. So any general term is linguistic, and all our general thoughts has general terms that give it a kind of normative structure, where in book 3, he sort of says it's an artifice, somewhat like the artifices of justice. It's a rule-governed structure where our thought has reference implicitly, he's saying, or just as our actions have reference to the actions of others in relation to property. Implicitly, he's saying, so also our thoughts have reference to the thoughts of others and their attitudes towards us in our very thinking of general thoughts using language at all. So I just wasn't sure why you wanted to emphasize it so much in the case of reason rather than more broadly in Hume's sort of thought, very significant commitment to the sociality of the mind in the treatise.
Okay, good. I think the notion of reasonableness that I'm interested in is actually fundamentally social. That's kind of the twist, and it builds up on Annette Byer's work, and it just sort of focuses more on the idea that how can you be sociable? What kind of function has sentiment, which is not necessarily sociable, because it's kind of coming from this idea that there's human species and we all resemble one another. How does that guide thoughts such that there can be social agreement? So if sentiment is part of process of judgment, so I think the notion of reasonable that I'm interested in is derived from his account of judgment as it is presented in book 3. And the type of reasonableness that falls out of the possibility of agreeing with one another and having social or discourse, right? Rational discourse with one another. Then the question, of course, is how does that sit with the narrower notion of reason, like demonstrative, probabilistic reasoning, and so forth. So, and the idea was to look at basically what goes wrong in book 1 when he says that, like it seems to me that he really is struggling with the idea of what self-identifying as reasonable. And I think that all comes together, that you have, so what's going wrong is the disconnect from the social sphere, the disconnect from sentiment, so disconnect from social spheres qua sentiment, not relying on a standardized process of thought. So other people cannot follow through the procedure of judgment that Hume used in his skeptical reflections. So, and this goes back to Martin's point. So there's not just not being able to agree. It is, of course, if I say there's a natural sentiment, you should be able to rely on the sentiment regardless of whether or not there are other people surrounding you. But it's just this destabilizing influence that you might be happy with your reasoning, but if you think further and further and further, you lose a grip on what is actually going on in your mind, and then you're confronted with nothing but doubt. And then it seems why I'm also interested in Boucher is this idea of a principle of thought. That sort of there has to be a standardized process of thought being used somehow. And how do you, and this is the part I left out, how do you know that it is a standardized process of thought if all you have is just your own mind and you don't know what you're doing, right? You have this feeling, but you don't know, and you can be dragged away immediately each moment as it happens in 141. So sort of bring it back to your question more concretely. I think I am hugely interested in this aspect of what does it mean to have agreement, but then want to see the conception of social agreement in the light of the discourse of human nature, but also specifically what sentiment is doing for the mind in terms of creating this type of agreement. That is social agreement, of course, and that plays a role in that arena, and it's very important.
Right. Sorry for the dysfunction earlier. I had a problem with the mouse, so I couldn't unmute myself. Now that I have unmuted myself, let me tell you that there are a couple of questions and we don't have enough time to take all of them. And Richard had his hand up for a very long time. So I would ask Richard Stewart to ask the question, and then we see how much time we can try to be short.
Thank you. So my computer blacked out for a little bit, so I had to miss a few minutes. Well, I have a sort of gift for Charles, actually. The first is there was a wonderful interview with John Cage a while ago, and someone asked him, "What do you consider your most important quality?" And he said, "I was gifted with a cheerful disposition." So, so there's a little bit for you. Slightly more seriously, one great support for your view of Hume would be in someone who is more almost a contemporary of Hume, Dr. Johnson, who was notably melancholic, and in writing about Shakespeare, he's trying to figure out what makes Falstaff, who is a liar, a thief, a cheat, et cetera, what makes him so attractive. And he decides that it's the most compelling of all human qualities, perpetual gaiety. And so just a wonderful kind of passage from the period, and pointing back to Shakespeare, where I think, I can send you a reference to this, where I think there's a sense in which happiness is a value for Shakespeare. I've actually written a little essay on this, but a place where you can see it in very nicely laid out in relation to Falstaff is a W.H. Auden's essay on Henry IV called The Prince's Dog. And he picks up on the Dr. Johnson analysis of Falstaff's attractiveness. And it's just quite wonderful stuff, and includes a rabbinical passage about cheerfulness as the greatest of all virtue. And also there's a little footnote to that. There's a passage in Augustine's Confessions about why he finds this sort of drunk on the street attractive. And it's the same answer. So I give you a little set of references that might be unusual for a professional philosopher.
Thank you.
Right. Unfortunately, our time is up, but I think that that's a very cheerful ending for our seminar. So maybe we should stop here and thank our speakers. Apologies for those who didn't manage to ask their questions. Many thanks to our speakers.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful session. See you all next week.
Thank you, Manuel, for putting this together.